Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Crawford coming to you from Central Park because the apartment's occupied and it's time to make videos. I need to talk to you about Christopher Hitchens and why Orwell matters. Now, if you watch or listen to much Hitchens, you'll know that he jumps around a lot, doesn't he? He skips from one thing to another gratuitously, we might say. So, I'm just going to go through and read thoughts from it, as it were. This is one of the few books that I brought with me. I'll have the rest following as soon as possible, but that may be months. So I've been reading this one while I walk around and fill out applications and such. Well, on the first third leaf in the first page, dedication page or whatever. It's not a dedication page, it's just a quote he considers salient, I guess, to the discussion he launches into in this book. It's from Marcel Proust, P-R-O-U-S-T, Within a Budding Grove. I'm not going to read the whole thing, I'm going to take a few parts out of it. He says, genius, even great talent, springs less from seeds of intellect and social refinement and so on, and more from the faculty of transforming and transposing things. Okay, fine. So great intellect doesn't proceed from social refinement. Now hold that in your pocket for a minute. To heat a liquid with an electric lamp requires not the strongest lamp, but one in which the current can cease to illuminate and be diverted so as to give off heat instead of light. So put that in your pocket. You don't, if you want to heat oil, you don't get a stronger and brighter light to put next to it. You get a heating element, even though it's just an electric current one way or the other. To mount the skies, to fly, you don't just think in terms of faster or better movement along the surface. You have to think in terms of a machine that'll move, turn its force into moving upward. So you have to think in a different, you don't just have to come up with a new answer, you have to think in different terms altogether. Similarly, now a direct quote, the men who produce works of genius are not those who live in the most delicate atmosphere, whose conversation is the most brilliant or their culture the most extensive, but those who have had the power, ceasing suddenly to live only for themselves, more about that, to transform their personality into a sort of mirror in such a way that their life, however mediocre may be socially, and even in a sense intellectually, is reflected by a genius consisting in reflecting power, not in the intrinsic quality of the scene reflected. Geez, I might cut the end of that off because it gets so rambling. But the point is, I got a kid coming up on me here, but the point is that you have to think in different terms, but not necessarily platonic and any sort of terms unrelated to the world. He's okay. Had a little visitor, just wondering what I'm doing, I guess. Alright, we're going to skip Christopher Hitchens' acknowledgments, and there's a wonderful poem by Robert Conquest that he starts with in the introduction. And the poem is titled George Orwell, written in 1969. And I'm afraid that it's worth reading. It's 6 stanzas long, and every one of them is pretty good. You can't skip them, really, so... Moral and mental glaciers melting slightly betray the influence of his warm intent, because he taught us what the actual meant, the vicious winter grips its prey less tightly. So he melted frost, so he's setting up here an image of frozen, frost, cold, as being the immoral, the bad. And he says that George Orwell melted the mental glaciers slightly. And he had a warm intent, because he taught us what the actual meant, the vicious winter grips its prey less tightly. I'm going to skip a stanza to bury you to the 3rd stanza. We die of words, full stop. I put the full stop in there, but there really is a period. We die of words. That, I think, is a pretty good line, pretty profound and interesting. True. For touchstones, he restored the real person real event or thing, and thus we see not war but suffering as the conjunction to be most abhorred. Now let's pause on that thought for half a second. We see not war but suffering as the conjunction to be most abhorred. Conjunction meaning the coming together. So war we might be able to put up with in certain senses, in certain occasions, depending on what's going on. But suffering, that is not something we can put up with. That is not a value. That's not useful or good. He shared with a great world for greater ends that honesty, a curious, cunning virtue, you share with just the few who don't desert you, a dozen riders, half dozen friends. That's a pretty profound one. He shared with a great world for greater ends, so he shared it with everybody. That honesty, a curious, cunning virtue, you share with just the few who don't desert you, a dozen writers, half a dozen friends. So, in all of your lifetime, there will only be a handful of people who don't desert you. A dozen writers, half a dozen friends. I think that's a profound line just in itself. You'll find a dozen writers, in all the books and stuff, who won't desert you at all through your whole life. There will never be a time you're at odds with them. But you'll only find half a dozen friends, face-to-face friends. A moral genius and truth-seeking brings sometimes a silliness we view askance, like Darwin playing his bassoon to plants. Right, so see, Darwin's pretty silly anyways. He too had lapses, but he claimed no wings. Another fantastic line. So, moral geniuses are sometimes a bit silly, like Darwin playing his bassoon for his plants, but Darwin didn't claim any wings. He didn't say that he was perfect, right? Sure, he was imperfect, but he never said he was. Now, that brings up the whole issue of what is moral perfection. Should moral perfection be described as that which is not obtainable? I don't think that it should be. I think moral perfection should be defined as obtainable. But if you want to use that terminology, no, Darwin wasn't perfect, and like it says here, he didn't claim wings. He claimed no wings. While those who drowned a truth's empiric part in dithyram or dogma turn frenetic, than whom no writer could be less poetic, he left this lesson for all verse, all art. Than whom no writer could be less poetic. So he's one of the least poetic writers you can name, and he left this lesson for all verse and all art. George Orwell did. I thought that was worth it. Robert Conquest, George Orwell. Now, I know about Robert Conquest from a book called Harvest of Sorrow, about the collectivization of the farms in Russia in the 1930s. Well, now, on to Christopher Hitchens proper. We're in the introduction, we're on page 3. We're skipping down a little bit past the poem. Now, he talks about V.S. Pritchett and all these other guys. Don't worry about that. But then he says, Orwell's own work is much preoccupied with the demoralizing effect of the freezing point and not entirely free from. So this is back to the cold. He's using the cold visualization of immorality, of wrong, of evil. He's visualizing it as cold, frozen, icy. He says Orwell's own work is demoralized a bit by the idea that the freezing point, here it is, the ancestral belief that a cold plunge is a good thing. Orwell's writing is not entirely free from the ancestral belief that a cold plunge is a good thing. And I guess Hitchens is here saying that it says it's an ancestral belief, and therefore I think he's being derogatory towards it. So a cold plunge into the evil or the bad is somehow cathartic or something? Thinks Orwell in some ways, and Hitchens, I think, disagrees with that. We skip down a little ways. He mentions Mahatma Gandhi. The saints are always to be adjudged guilty until proven innocent. Now Hitchens just says the profane and humorous writer who said of Mahatma Gandhi that the saints are always to be adjudged guilty until proven innocent.